speaking, there's a goal in liberal education to encourage students to learn how to learn by being critical thinkers, not just to reproduce facts on an examination, and to question their professors. Not that we want them necessarily doubting everything we say, but we don't want them either just passively accepting what's conveyed in class. Finally, liberal education is often residential. This goes back to the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge in the 13th and 14th centuries, and here in the US in the 17th and 18th centuries, a number of our colleges were founded as residential communities, and that continues to be the case. And I've found in visiting experiments in liberal education in other parts of the world that while many universities have most of their students living in town or off campus, often when a liberal education effort is made, the students are brought together to live together as part of their experience. Now, I'd like to talk very briefly about the history in the West, and then I'd like to talk about liberal education in Asia today, or in the last generation or so. The roots of liberal education have generally been traced to ancient Greece and Rome. Liberal education was the education appropriate for a citizen. This is, of course, in many Greek city-states and in the Roman Empire, citizen was a sort of a special status. So it was, although the democracy originates in Greece, it was in a sense an aristocratic attitude that only those who had enough people working for them, often slaves, could spend the time necessary to develop an education. So it tended to be for the wealthy and the dominant classes. In the European Middle Ages, the liberal arts were defined and specified in, and again, here you get the fact that arts refers both to the arts and what we would call the sciences, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music being those that are mathematically related, and grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium, those that are related to language. And the skilled use of both mathematical thinking and language were key to the liberal education tradition. I would also say that despite that, even in Greece and Rome, where you had very hierarchical societies, there was a notion of freedom inherent in the idea of a liberal education. And when you get to US higher education, particularly after the American Revolution, there was a strong sense that part of the purpose of liberal education was to educate citizens for a free society, ultimately a democracy. As a result, there was a very strong normative sense, the sense of what should people learn, which created a unified liberal arts curriculum in the United States during most of the 19th century. There's a famous set of reports from 1828 written by the Yale faculty and president of the time, outlining the benefits of a liberal education for a growing new country. In the 20th century, with the greater specialization, the growth of research universities, attention to science and scientific research, and in general, the turn towards an ideal of research as what a university professor should be spending their time on, and perhaps to some extent what a college student should be learning how to do. The old idea of a unified curriculum that everybody would study was replaced by other forms of general education, such as distributional requirements, where students were asked to take a certain number of courses in the sciences, the social sciences, the arts and humanities, and so on. Or in some cases, a core curriculum where students were assigned particular courses that were meant to give them a strong introduction to the tradition of the liberal arts. And I'll mention in particular that two of the most famous of those, Columbia and Chicago's core curricula, were developed in the wake of the first two world wars. And I think that element of trauma and desire to recover from trauma is something I'll come back to with respect to liberal education today and in the near future. Now, looking back over the past generation in Asia, there's been a lot of interest in liberal education. I think this is partly because Asian educators and government leaders have seen the attraction of the American university system. I think it's also got to do with the demands from students, especially middle-class students in Asia, for a type of learning that focuses more on active learning, that is perhaps more interdisciplinary, less specialized, and particularly that emphasizes what's often called critical thinking. This is sometimes a bit of a caricature. I often hear people say, oh, in Asia, they don't teach critical thinking. I don't think that's true, but it is the case that more specialized approaches to study that are typical of Asian universities, or were typical of Asian universities in the late 20th century, have seemed to some people to train people for a particular career when what's needed is a broader kind of education. And so, for example, in Singapore, where I was very involved, there was a sense that they were very good at training lawyers and engineers and doctors, but they wanted to train people for a much more complex modern economy where they might, for example, change jobs, be involved in innovation, and so on. So these were issues that came up. There are many Asian traditions of liberal education. I'll just mention the 6 arts of the Confucian tradition and the fact that music, calligraphy, and mathematics, which are among them, overlap directly with the liberal arts of the West. And that, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in the past generation or so, you've seen a renewed interest in the role of liberal education in preparing students for innovation and for a complex economy, in holistic education, and also to some extent in preparation for citizenship, although obviously that depends to a large degree on the political atmosphere and system. I also have noticed on visits to a number of Asian liberal arts colleges that programs tend to be taught in English and have an international dimension. And I think this is one of the things that attracts strong students to these kinds of programs. Here are just a few examples of liberal arts institutions in Asia that I've visited over the last several years. Some of them are as much as about 20 years old. Many of them are quite new. Lingnan University is older, and there are several other examples of older schools built on a model inspired by US education, but very much none of these are a simple copy of American style liberal education. And I'll just end this section by mentioning Yale NUS College, where, as the dean mentioned, I was the founding president. This is a picture of our beautiful courtyard, lush in a way that the courtyards of New Haven, Connecticut really aren't. And I had the pleasure of living, if you look on the upper right-hand corner here, my apartment was up there. So I got to look down onto this courtyard every morning, which was just wonderful. Our sort of mission statement at Yale NUS was that we were a community of learning founded by 2 great universities in Asia for the world. And I'll emphasize that community part of the message in the coming parts of the talk. So I think that's what I had to say about liberal education up until now, as sort of setting the place for the further conversation about the future. I don't know if Joey, you have any questions for me, or if anybody in the audience does.
Right. As of now, there seems to be no questions. I think we can proceed to the next section.
Okay, thanks.
If I could ask one more question.
Yeah, sure.
If you could, yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering about, in your experience as the founding president of the Yale NUS College, and just wondering about your experience of teaching both liberal art education in the US and in Asia. Which sort of subject you think translate well for Asian students, and which sort of subject you find pretty much challenging, for Asian students?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I guess that Yale is very well known for literary studies. And I did find that students in Singapore were very interested in literature, but I found some reluctance to make literature their main topic, because I think they felt that it wasn't as practically oriented. So one of the things I noticed among our students in Singapore was that while they wanted a broad liberal education, they tended to want it as part of a way to solve problems. And so some of our most popular topics there were things like environmental studies, urban studies, global affairs. How do you go about taking the knowledge of the humanities and the social sciences to sort of change and transform the world? I don't know to what extent that's specific to Asia or to what extent it's a generational thing, because I've also noticed here in New Haven that our students, 22 years ago when I started teaching here, Yale was extremely well known for the humanities, and a lot of students came wanting to be writers or journalists or what have you. More and more of our students want to study science, but also the largest number want to study the social sciences, I think because they feel that's where they can have a grasp on current problems and social issues. So you had actually asked me, Dina, if I could talk about the future of the humanities after COVID-19, and I asked for a slightly broader topic of the future of liberal education after COVID-19. I think the humanities part of it is probably a change that we are seeing in the humanities, is an eagerness for humanities scholars to also address broad social challenges rather than, as it were, more scholarly or antiquarian interests. The upside of that is that people want to make the world a better place, which is great. The downside, I think, is that sometimes there's a lack of attention to history. And I do think the history of things is very important, but people are very present oriented in their concerns these days.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we have one question, actually two questions from our participants. The first question is, I have heard in the news about what happened at Yale and US College, namely that some faculty at Yale opposed of the idea, saying that the liberal tradition of Yale and of liberal education was compromised by the authoritarian stance that existed in Singapore. I would be glad to hear your comments about this situation right now in 2020.
That's a great question. I think, so we started the college, we agreed to start it about 2011, and we were just sort of celebrating the fact it had been a decade since we started the discussions. I think at the beginning, there was some concern among some of my colleagues at Yale that Singapore is not as prone to free speech as the United States, that particularly it has a record of censoring journalism. And there was some concern about whether there was adequate protection of academic freedom. My experience with Singapore is that they are pretty hands-off with respect to the universities, and that academic freedom is not a problem. That isn't to say that they have the same notions of free expression as the US. So, for example, students aren't allowed to walk down Orchard Road and protest or show up at Parliament waving signs. And the political sphere is sort of influenced by things like libel suits against opposition members and so on. I'm not holding up US politics as the ideal politics, but my view of it at the time was that, we can work with a country that respects academic freedom and that is seeking some of the same goals that we're seeking in terms of liberal education, which I've sort of mentioned, and I'll outline a little more in the future. For the most part, I think we've been very successful. It hasn't been without its tensions. When I was president, I had discussions with the government about making sure that all books could be allowed in the library, making sure that films critical of the government could be screened on campus, those kinds of things. So it was a negotiation on both sides, but I think it was worthwhile because I think we started something good. And I also think that you're not going to get to a place of greater breadth and discussion of multiple points of view if you only partner with people who agree with you about absolutely everything.
Thank you. I think let's have this last one question before we proceed to the next. The question goes, another point is a bit related to the earlier one, which is the question I asked earlier. It may seem that cultural traditions in Asia do not appear to lend themselves well to liberal tradition. Having had some experience in the East, what would be your comments in this point?
I have heard that, and it hasn't been my experience in Asia. Now, for one thing, in Asian cultures, there's a great reverence for the past. I mentioned Confucius. If you're in Beijing at the Temple of Confucius, you can see the names of the great scholars of maybe the 12th century inscribed on the steles in the courtyard there. So there's a long tradition, and I'm sure that this is true in Thailand too, and I've seen it firsthand in India, a long tradition of scholarship and concern for tradition. And now some Asian governments have tended to then turn to, for example, Confucius and say that supports an authoritarian political system. If you actually read Confucius, it's not clear that he does. But I think that idea that learning is something that's highly valued is pretty widespread in Asia. Now, that said, at least historically, the cultures of Asia tended to be a little bit more deferential. And so it's an interesting question. A lot of colleagues of mine have talked about how do you get Asian students who might be reluctant to challenge the professor or speak up in class to do so. I think that's a matter of creating a culture that encourages it. And I've found that people at many universities in many different parts of Asia have been quite successful at getting students to not just see the professor as an authority who hands down the wisdom, but to also see them as somebody that you can have a dialogue with, which I think is an essential part of liberal education.
Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful answer. I believe we
Thanks,
can now
Joe.
proceed to the next section.
Good. The next section is relatively short. It's about liberal education during the pandemic. As it happens, my other job here is what's called Vice Provost for Academic Initiatives. So I spent the last 6 months, I actually started as soon as COVID started, paying attention to what was going on in China and in Singapore and ultimately in Europe, where we have various international partnerships. But once it hit the United States in late February, early March, we had to shut down and move to what we call emergency remote instruction, where the faculty had to all of a sudden learn how to use Zoom and other online tools to educate students. I think we were reasonably successful, all things considered. We put a lot of effort into it. But I think the thing about liberal education that is in tension with what's going on today in the pandemic, I'm going to use an expression my former boss, the provost Ben Polak here uses, which is collisional frequency. And this is just to show that I'm not just about the humanities. This is the science part of the talk. You don't need to know what this means, but this is a formula for the collision, and I couldn't explain it. The collision frequency of a single gas I think it's in a cylinder. So point being that collision frequency is the atoms or molecules hitting each other as things speed up and as they move around. And collisional frequency is a very important part of educational institutions, I would say, especially of liberal education institutions. If you look at the picture I showed a moment ago of the college in Singapore, we designed it around courtyards with opportunities to run into each other, because a big part of the education is not just the classroom and the conversation there, but also the conversations that happen in the hallway or in the courtyard or in the dining hall or late at night in the dorm room. And the challenge is, of course, that while we're building these institutions to try and encourage people to interact with each other, we're now faced with the challenge of physical and social distancing in order to prevent the spread of the pandemic. We're trying to deliver courses online, where although it's remarkable, in fact, how much one is able to do online. And I started to learn that already 10 years ago when we were setting up Yale at US College, when we had forerunners of Zoom that we were using that worked reasonably well. Nonetheless, you lose a certain kind of texture, you lose the ability for a more informal kind of exchange, you lose a lot of the signals, physical signals and so on, but most of all, from the point of view of a residential education, you lose just that serendipitous running into people and having a chat about something you've been reading. Now we're fortunate in Connecticut. We were somewhat unfortunate at the beginning because April was very, very bad here in Connecticut, and we lost about 1.5 out of every 1,000 people in Connecticut. So relatively high death rate to COVID. But since then, we've recovered reasonably well, and the levels of transmission are very low now. So we were able to bring about 80% of our students back. Everybody's wearing masks, everybody's sitting 6 feet apart. Much of the courses are being delivered online. I had great conversations with our colleagues in Singapore about how they were handling some of the same challenges. But basically, we have to reduce collisional frequency. So how do you manage an education that's all about getting people in touch with one another when you have to keep them apart? And we haven't quite got the answer to that, I'd say. There's a related notion of collisional frequency that I like to quote from Gandhi. This is about the cultural dimension of a liberal education. And in Singapore, we set up a curriculum that focused on both the Western and Asian liberal traditions. Gandhi says, and this is apropos of the question of studying English literature, he says, "I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any." What I like about that is the use of the metaphor of the house as a way of describing the interaction among different cultures. And that connects to the college, the structure of the college around a courtyard. Even if you go back to Confucius or Aristotle, the great thinkers of the ancient world, they tended to either have students sit around and talk or go for a walk and talk, sit in a grove or wherever it might be. And that remains the fact that you want to have space, and outdoor space is healthier, as we know, than indoor space, to interact with each other, to talk, and to allow the collision of ideas and cultures. And so, at the moment, we're facing a lot of challenges in accomplishing that, as I'm sure you all are at your institutions. I have some ideas about what this might mean for the future, but maybe we could take a break there and talk, see if there are questions about the issue of liberal education during the pandemic.
Thank you so much. We have one question. Let me read that for you. The question goes, in Indonesia, it is impossible to realize liberal education concept, as in our country, there are many limitations in realizing it, especially about facilities at school or campus. How to solve this problem, and is it possible to realize this concept, as we know this concept cannot be separated from a little bit political concerns?
Sorry, Joey, you said the facilities were an issue too. I missed one line of what you were reading out.
Right. I believe he was referring to facilities in the campus, or I'm thinking maybe readings, like libraries, that is quite important for liberal education.
So, I agree with the sentiment of the question. I have visited Indonesia, and I've enjoyed talking to educators there. I think, obviously, the political situation is very important. The political authorities, in order to have, I think, successful universities, political authorities have to give them a certain level of autonomy. I don't want to speak about other countries because, each country has its own system, and I'm not terribly well informed about all of them, although I do read the news and I visit these countries. But just looking at the United States, we have a history of private universities, but they are funded in large part by the government through research funding, for example, or aid to students who then use the aid to pay their tuition. And we have a much larger public sector of universities. I think the private sector universities have some advantage in that they are less beholden to political interests, and there's a little bit less of a tendency for the state legislature, for example, to start opining about what should be taught or about who should be fired or that kind of thing. But it's not by any means the case that we're totally free of political pressure, in particular because of our exemption from tax and the fact that we're dependent on federal funds for research support. Even in the public system, where technically in most states of the United States, the governor ultimately controls the universities, we do have a tradition of autonomy of universities. It's been broken at times, and we've seen a few challenges to it in the last several years. But I think that notion that the universities are autonomous is absolutely essential for a successful educational system. Now, within whatever system you have, it's true that facilities and resources mean a lot. It is very helpful if, for example, the students don't have to work many long hours to earn money while they're in school, but that they can instead focus on their studies. It's much better if the faculty have relatively fewer students rather than hundreds and hundreds of students they have to educate. It's just harder to be in touch with people. I do think there's certain advantages here in terms of the internet and, communications technology in general. For example, it's much easier now to get documents. You don't necessarily have to be at a great library in order to get copies of documents. It depends a little on copyright and so on, but there are lots of great ways that books and documents are shared on the internet. I also think that there are opportunities for building community, and this is something I didn't go into so much about today during the pandemic, but we've found ways to continue conversations outside of class hours through assignments or wiki pages or other kinds of group projects that allow people to work with one another without actually being physically in the classroom at the same time. So I do think there are ways, and that would apply also in the case of, say, a very large university that had relatively few faculty. You can encourage the students to engage in those kinds of projects.
Right. Thank you so much. We have another interesting question, which I think is a challenge for most scholars. So let me read that for you. So the climate in Thailand nowadays is such that things related to educational and research policy are largely controlled by the scientists and the engineer. The
Yeah.
question every one of us has faced is, of course, what would you do with liberal education? In terms of research policy, much funding, of course, goes to the sciences. So what would be, in your view, the justification for allocation of more funding for the arts and the humanities?
Well, in the next part of the talk, I mentioned some of the traditional justifications for liberal education, which I think are relevant today as well. I think the ones that might carry the most weight with policymakers and the people who allocate budgets would have to do with evidence that students who've had a broader liberal education are successful in their careers after they leave the university, and that they develop skills that they might not develop if they take a strict science course. So, for example, the study of philosophy can help people make more rigorous analysis. The study of literature can, in addition to its, I think, ethical and aesthetic benefits, it also can help people with communication. So not so much that there's a direct skill that you're learning from it as that you're learning to approach problems in a more critical and more diverse way. And I think that point has been understood by policymakers. And I think there's evidence that students recognize it, and that top students in particular want to have a broader kind of education. Even if they're going to major in physics or engineering or computer science, they may want to have something more than just that in their education. We see it in Singapore. Our students have done, now admittedly it's a very selective group of students, so that helps, but they've done very, very well in jobs and applying to graduate school and so on after graduating. And that kind of result tends to convince policymakers that it's worth the investment.
Thank you so much. We have one more question, but I think this is best to be answered after the next session, as I believe you will touch on some issues that this question may be answered. So we can.
Terrific. Okay, good. So as I say, I don't really have my crystal ball with me, but I'll talk a little bit about the role of liberal education after COVID-19, which is actually what I was asked to speak about. So here are some traditional purposes of liberal education that I talk a lot about with my students. The first is, the development of character. This one is sometimes seems a little quaintly Victorian nowadays, but I think the idea that students are learning responsibility for their own behavior, especially young people in their early adult years, 18 to 22 or so, is very important. And I do think that the opportunity to study and think and contemplate is a great occasion for developing character. I think the sense of community at university or college is extremely important and a big part of why people look back on their college years very positively. The United States is a relatively wealthy country, and even though growth has somewhat stagnated in the last generation or so, which has had great costs, and even though we're currently in a recession, it's still the case that a very large fraction of our young people are able to pursue post-secondary education. Some countries have now surpassed the United States in this regard. I think the fact of being able to invest those extra years in somebody's education really makes a difference. As I said earlier, it makes a difference economically because they develop skills that are valuable. But I think it also makes a difference, and I would love to be able to extend it to everybody, to give people a chance, a sort of a pause between their childhood at home with their families and their responsibilities of adult life, where they think about what they're looking forward to in life and what they want to become. Again, unfortunately not available to everybody under our current economic arrangements, but I think it's not impossible to imagine a time when at least some post-secondary education was more or less universal. Conversation, this goes back to our discussion about liberal education as not so much the authoritative professor handing down the gospel, but interaction between faculty and students, but it's also the conversations that the students have on their own or with graduate students or, outside the formal classroom. And then education for citizenship. As I mentioned, this is an important part of the tradition in the US. Again, this gets very political very quickly. There are those who think that we should be educating people to have a more patriotic view of the country. There are those who think we should be educating them about the inequalities and failings of the country. but I think more broadly speaking, the opportunity to live in a community in which there's usually some element of self-government for the students, and even if they're not involved in student government per se, they might be involved in debating societies or newspapers or even sports teams where they learn something about getting along with one another. And hopefully in their education, they also learn something about the history of their countries and of the world that allows them to be better citizens. Now, there are a couple of purposes that strike me as important in the future, and that this is where things get a little hazier for me. I think what we're going through now is a collective trauma. I've been, of course, very fortunate, although I've lived at home for the last 6 months and I've only been able to come back to my office recently. I've been relatively unaffected, and although there's been quite a lot of death in Connecticut, it's been it's been somewhat contained, and we haven't had a huge crisis in our health system. Nonetheless, I think we all feel the trauma of this time, and I'm sure there are people on this call who've had much more direct encounters with COVID-19. I think the economic fallout is going to be fairly long lasting. I think there was some hope for a quick snapback. At present, I'm not an epidemiologist by a long shot, but at present, I think the outlook is not quite so promising. I think we're able to sort of keep it under control in waves, but I don't think we're in a position where we can foresee it's being defeated anytime in the next several months. So I think this is going to last a lot longer. From an educational point of view, even here in New Haven, where we're doing pretty well, the public schools are not reopening in person. And there's evidence that this has a particularly negative effect on lower income students. And that's quite worrisome because those students are already at a disadvantage. So I do worry that it will take years to recover, and that those who have lived through this period, I think I'm not so worried about, my children or the students in my classes, although even they, I think, are probably losing something. But I do worry about the lower income students in the public schools in my neighborhood and throughout the world who will lose opportunity, and I think that's going to take some time to come back from. So that's just one small dimension, but a significant dimension of the collective trauma. Then looking forward in a more positive sense, my colleague who's the head of our Institute for Global Health, Saad Omer, talks about building sustainable resilience. This is important in an environmental sense, important in a public health sense, but also I think in a cultural and community sense, that we must anticipate that there will be other crises, maybe not quite as bad as COVID-19, but conceivably worse. We also face the crises brought on by climate change. And I think even though the list of goals of liberal education that I brought up on the last slide might look fairly traditional, I think if you look at them, they are important elements in preparing for a sustainable and resilient future, in particular notions of community and citizenship and educating people to work together rather than apart from one another will be very important. And just to conclude, I wanted to ask a question. This is a question I asked students. It was part of how we designed the curriculum at Yale NUS College. What must a young person learn in order to lead a responsible life in this century? I don't think there's one single answer to that, but I do think it's important for young people to ask themselves this. And I also think it's important for the faculty and the administrators, the people who run the colleges and universities, to think about, what do we want our young people to learn? Obviously, there's huge demand for computer science because there are careers in that area. And I certainly think it's good for people to learn some kind of computer science or something about computers. But there are broader issues, things that people should learn. I point out that I strongly believe in the liberal tradition of broad education or training, and I think that's going to continue to be important. I do mention that when we talk about the liberal arts in the West, in the US, we're talking about the arts and sciences, and I do think the strong evidence of a lack of scientific literacy among huge swaths of the population, which is contributing to the resistance to public health measures, especially in the US, but probably in other countries too, indicates the importance of improved science education. I think we see the importance of technical knowledge. Again, we're not all going to become epidemiologists, however much we may think we are when we're using social media or whatever. But the ability to interpret statistics is something that's really pretty weak, I think, in the culture. And so I realize I'm not here focusing so much on the humanities, but I think that a broad liberal education should include both humanistic approaches and more technical approaches. And I think essential to all of this is an education for global citizenship, making people aware of global challenges and more capable of responding to them. Finally, I have some hope. An event like today's gives me some hope that there are ways of forming community that we have not been able to make as good use of in the past. Social media have had many, many negative effects, but I do think the ability to connect with people around the world has an upside too. And for educators, it has the possibility that things like cultural exchange and so on can be practiced at a lower cost and without travel, given all the restrictions on travel and so on. And so there may be some educational and academic and even research benefits to our new technologies. That's the end of my formal presentation. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to turn off the sharing so we can see each other. And I know Joey has a few more questions for me.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I believe that covers a lot of issues concerning liberal education. And before I actually go to the next question, I'll build a little bit of a background. Because as you know, most students are now faced with overwhelming bulk of information, as we see in various social media platforms. The students actually consume more than information than what they used to before COVID. In this view, personally, I believe that liberal education becomes even more relevant and significant at that, more particularly when we talk about, critical thinking, reasoning, argument building. So from this point, how do you think we can make liberal education more significant in a sense that people outside that community will understand why we need to give more attention to the liberal arts, basically giving more funding, giving more training, and perhaps allowing a rich conversation that tackles pressing issues so students will be able to participate to the dialogue as regards social issues?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Joey. I think that the, under the broad category of information literacy, I think that one of the big challenges we have now is that many people get their theories off the internet. They have a harder time assessing the validity of various arguments. There's also the bubble phenomenon where they hear only the arguments that they already believe in or only the evidence for the arguments they already believe in. We often talk about teaching critical thinking. It's a phrase I don't use that much because I think it's a little bit empty. It's not that specific, but it does refer to something, the ability to look at a problem and analyze it critically. And this is something that the arts and the sciences both teach. And I think that helping to convince the policymakers that students need this broader kind of ability to think critically, I think that should, in a sense, be apparent. Now, of course, we go back to the political dimension that somebody mentioned earlier. It may be that not all governmental authorities want people to think more critically, but the success of a society and an economy do depend on it. And so hopefully at least the enlightened policy leaders will see that.
Thank you. Let's have
Can I ask one question?
Go on, Professor Chotiudompant.
Yes. Okay. Just one more question about the liberal education that, after listening to Professor Lewis's talk for almost an hour, and I feel like I couldn't agree more about the important role that liberal education has, on the shaping of the mentality of our future generation. I'm just wondering now on the dimension of the emotion. And I read a couple of your papers, and you talk about the broad spirit that you want to foster in the mindset of the new generations of people. I'm just wondering whether, on the side of, apart from academic knowledge that students have, what about emotional cultivation?
There's a wonderful quotation from Mencius on this matter that I'm not going to be able to reproduce, but he basically says that the effect of a gentleman, this is a certain kind of language, but of a gentleman on his students is like spring rain. And so I think the job of the teacher is, in a way, and this is something very familiar in Asian cultures, I think the job of a teacher, not to make the students just follow you unquestioningly, but to get the students to help inspire in the students some sense of belonging, community, emotional development, as you say. And I think that in terms of institutional arrangements, I think whatever we can do to create small communities, ideally diverse communities. Diverse can mean different things in different parts of the world, but communities where it's not just reproducing the people you knew already in your old neighborhood, but where you meet new people, interact with them and learn from them. I think that can be very valuable. And so, you know, there are a variety of ways to do that. I mentioned the residential dimension, that obviously if people live together, then they have to get to know each other and get along. But there are other ways to do it too, a little less formally than requiring them to live together. And I do think that's an essential part of a liberal education.
Right. Thank you so much. So I think we have quite a few questions.
Yeah, actually we have a lot of questions, but I think we have.
I'm not hearing the dean so well. Joey, are you?
Right. Yeah, I think the internet is right.
It's okay now. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
All right. Yeah, I think we have several questions, but perhaps we can just answer one. I think we only have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
But this question is quite very relevant as everyone faces this problem. So the question goes like in the Philippines, many private higher education institutions are commercializing the idea of preparing students to face the problematics of the 21st century learning and the pandemics by focusing more on science-centric courses. So the question goes, what seems the best way to promote literary studies or liberal education as a bridge of understanding, and what education truly is in creating meanings about community and sense of citizenship?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So I will also say that, you know, on the private versus public institutions, what that means in different countries varies a lot. We have a group of private for-profit universities. Some of them are probably fine, but on average, their behavior hasn't been very good in terms of promising students things that they can't really deliver. They can be pretty beneficial when it comes to a relatively straightforward credential for, you know, learning some technique or something like that. Now, all that said, the role of the humanities here. So we had to close down the university, as I'm sure many others did back in March. And I was reading a book on the history of Yale University. I happen to have it right here. Great book, somewhat traditional, doesn't tell all the bad things that happened at Yale. It focuses on the good things, but there's a great story of what happened during the American Revolution. And basically, in March of 1777, the college was only about 76 years old. The government, we were in that sense a sort of a public funded university. We were getting money from the Connecticut government, but the Connecticut government had to pay for General Washington's Continental Army to fight the British during the American Revolution, so they cut us off. One of the buildings was in disrepair and had to be torn down. There was a distemper, which is an unidentified virus spreading through the university, which made it hard to keep going. It was hard to get provisions, but most of all, they were afraid of a British invasion of New Haven, which did in fact happen a couple of years later. So the trustees had to vote in April of 1777 to close down the university for 2 years and to have an experiment in what today we would call distance education, where they sent the students to inland towns away from the shore so they wouldn't be affected by a British invasion, and then invited them back 2 years later to get their degrees by examination. Now, the whole story is wonderful, somewhat sad. The university only had 200 students at the time. It was a pretty small place, but it was one of the two biggest universities in the 13 colonies of the time. And reading that story and sharing it with my students and my colleagues, it just gives you a sense of some kind of perspective on our problems today and understanding the precedents for our problems. How did people solve variations on them at other times? I don't think you can understand, most broadly, just there are many great disciplines, art, history, music, literature, philosophy, but history is in a way the one that encompasses them all. I don't think you can understand your current times without thinking back and analyzing them as evolving out of history. And I think it's hard when you're a young person. I remember not being very interested in history when I was 15 or 16, and now it's practically, all I read when I have free time, much more than novels. And I think when you're 15 or 16, you think, oh, that's just old stuff that happened. But I think that opening the minds of young people to the way that our current predicaments have earlier antecedents, and also that they've been caused by things that happened in the past, is a great example of why just purely technical knowledge is never going to suffice to be a citizen, to run a country, to live a very full human life. So Dean Suradech, Joey, thank you very much for having me. It's really been a pleasure talking with this group.
So thank you so much, Professor Lewis. So let me say a few words just to kind of express how much I'm so grateful for your talk today. It's probably inspired as many as as I myself am at the moment, and talking about how liberal education is somehow integral to our life, and being in a future generation, through our exposed us to a kind of more complex role of liberal education, not just on the building of character, the building of the sense of citizenship, but now in the phase of the pandemic, the role of liberal education has something to do with relieving the trauma, the collective trauma that all of us are experiencing at the moment, as well as the building sort of like sustaining future for all of us. So thanks once again, for this wonderful talk. So we hope we have the honor of your talk again in the future if we can. And thanks so much.
Hope I can come see you in person sometime.
Okay, definitely you're being invited. So thanks so much. And on behalf of the Faculty of Arts, Chulalongkorn University, I just what I say is such a wonderful opportunity to have you with us here, even though for an hour. But in the future, hopefully we'll see each other in person. Once again, in Thailand, in Japan, in New Haven, Connecticut. Okay.
Very honored. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much,
Okay,
Professor
thank you. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Lewis. This talk actually crystallizes the role of liberal education, and your discussion touches upon issues and challenges of education in general, and worth looking back and revisiting the role of liberal education, particularly in the time of pandemic. As we try, I like to quote what you mentioned, to create a sustainable resilience, as there are more to come, but we just have to be ready. So thank you everyone for joining with us tonight. We appreciate you joining us. And for more information, if you wanted to keep updated on for further international talks of the Faculty of Arts, you may like us in the Facebook page at www.facebook.com/facultyofarts.chula, or you could also visit Faculty of Arts official website at www.arts.chula.ac.th. So thank you everyone, and have a wonderful evening, and have a wonderful day, Professor Lewis.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, bye-bye everyone. Thank you.